Hello and welcome. My name's Hayley and I'm one of the co-directors of the Space Skills Alliance. I'm delighted to welcome you to Stats and Chats today discussing women in the UK space sector, a new report published last week based on the findings of the 2020 Space Census. You can read our report on the website that was at the URL just a minute ago, and we'll be behind Joseph in just a minute. And if you have any questions for the panel, you can post them in the chat. My colleague Joseph will be chairing a session today, so I'll pass over to him now. Thanks.
Hello, thank you, Heidi. Yes, I am going to be chairing this panel, and I am joined by Ciara, Nafeesa, and Hayley. Anya, who was originally going to be speaking on this panel, unfortunately isn't able to join us today. So Ciara has very kindly stepped in her place. I'm going to ask the panel now to turn on their video and mics and introduce themselves one by one. So we'll start with Nafeesa.
Hi everyone, I'm Nafeesa Dajda. I'm Head of Regional Growth at the Satellite Applications Catapult.
And Hayley.
Hi everyone, I'm Hayley King. I'm a Marine Applications Expert at EUMETSAT.
Ciara.
Hi, I'm Ciara. I'm a lecturer in Aerospace Systems at the University of Manchester.
Thank you very much. So first question I want to ask you all is, you've had a look at the report. What stats surprised you or interested you or really shined with you the most? We'll start with Nafeesa.
Thanks, Joseph. So the stat that really kind of chimed with me the most was the one around 41% of women in the space sector experiencing discrimination or prejudice in any form compared to just 10% of men. And actually that one kind of chimed with me because it's an experience that nobody really wants to go through. No one wants discrimination in the workplace, but it's quite visible. It is obvious, and it is a shame that it happens. And I just wondered kind of what, for me, the challenge is how do we kind of report discrimination? How do we show, sometimes discrimination is just a feeling, or you get a sense of some discriminative act taking place, and how do you evidence that feeling? And that for me is the big challenge. So it's a really sad fact that there is discrimination in the workplace, but it's that how do we support people to report it and evidence it and capture their sense of feeling sometimes, rather than something very kind of factual or something that can be seen by others, say in a room, when it's very personal to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, especially coming hot on the heels of World Space Week, where we've been championing women in space and trying to inspire people to come into our sector, it's quite difficult to do that when at the same time you know some of the stats. Hayley? Hayley, can you hear us? Okay, we'll jump to Ciara. I think Hayley might be having some technical problems there.
Sure. Yeah, for me, I think the one that I kind of latched onto was this idea that women are less likely to be promoted to senior roles, and particularly that graph. When you look at it, the bar for men in senior is just huge, and the women are just teeny tiny next to it. And I think the reason that I latched onto that one is because I think it's quite insidious. So it's not just the fact that that we are less likely to reach those positions, which is obviously not good if that's a career path that you want for yourself. But I think it's also how that then it plays into all of the other problems that we see within the industry. Because if we don't have a diverse senior management team, then obviously we're going to struggle with putting together initiatives that will encourage a diverse workforce, and we've got that sort of mentoring chain where we know that biases come into play, and therefore if we've got senior management that fits a certain demographic, then obviously that's going to even unconsciously support people who also meet that demographic to move into senior management. So we've kind of got this self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think that for me really jumped out at me, because it was almost like, aha, you see there's a really big part of the problem right there.
Absolutely. And there's a related stat about, I think it came from Ivona, a recruitment firm, about how they a large number of women who are in those senior positions are there because they created the company that they're in the senior position for. And you shouldn't have to do that. Hayley, are you back with us now? You're muted.
My computer had a bit of a moment there. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good, excellent. Yeah, so the one that jumped out at me actually was the one that talked about how many women in the sector have other sort of intersecting identities that affect them as well. So there's a higher than average kind of proportion of women in the sector who are part of the LGBTQ community or have a disability, for example. And I think, this really shows that we can't just look at this as a women in space issue. It has to be women plus these other factors that influence their lives and potentially discrimination as well. So I was quite surprised to see that the people with those other identities were more present in the sector.
Yeah, it surprised us as well. And we see it to do with the stats about how welcome people feel, that, you feel less welcome if you're a woman, you feel less welcome if you're a person of color. And if you're a woman and a person of color, things are especially bad when you're at that intersection. And I'm sure, that the sample sizes for people with disabilities and who are LGBT mean that it's quite hard to look at all of those intersections at once. But I'm sure, the compounded effect is really difficult. So some really great starting points there for our discussion. So one of the things that we see in this report is, there's a lot of evidence of discrimination, but we also see in some of the quotes and in the statistics to do with how often people witness it and so on, that it doesn't really seem like it's being addressed. Why not? What is stopping us from taking action? Is it a case of people not reporting? Is it a case of people reporting and then nothing happens and then there's a sort of vicious cycle? Is there an issue, I think, as Nafeesa just mentioned, with actually it's really hard to report these kinds of things because they're sort of ephemeral and they're hard to evidence? I'll come to Nafeesa first on this, because I think you had a good point here.
Yeah, there's a couple of points around this. So it's that evidencing a feeling. I think also when you experience these acts of discrimination, it's actually hard to believe that it's happening at the time as well. In my experience and colleagues that I've spoken to within the Catapult who've also shared their experiences with me prior to this session. How when you're in a room, in a meeting, and in experiencing that discrimination happening, how you kind of questioning what you've heard, whether you're being too sensitive, perhaps, whether you've taken this personally in some way, what was the intention of the person kind of making the statement or the act at the time. And so when all of these things are kind of, you're questioning, self-doubting yourself, how do you then capture those thoughts? You've probably lost your train of thought in the meeting or in the situation itself. So how do you take that and turn that into something you can report? And then the question is, of course, who do you report that to? Because if other people are witnessing the same act and aren't surprised by it, aren't offended on your behalf, they're not acting as your allies at that moment in time, how do you then process those feelings, capture them, and then who do you share your experience with? And then how do you ask the people in that room that were alongside you at the time, if you had people around you, how do you ask them to step in and be your allies to provide that evidence? So I think it's a very, very kind of, for me and colleagues who've experienced this, I think it's really hard to know what the right next step is to make.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that is a real challenge. Is that something, Hayley, Ciara, that you've also found is the case?
I think one of the things I've noticed is that it can often be, and it is hard to evidence in the same way, things can be acts of omission, right? Where you just get left out of things. And then that's even harder to evidence because half the time you don't even know it's happening. You might only find out later, or if by luck you have a colleague that spots, this obvious person who should have been involved. Why weren't they involved? Let me get them involved. And that is a way people can act as allies, which is really, really important. I experienced this a little bit being on maternity leave. It's much easier to be forgotten when you are actually out of the office, and good colleagues will, keep an eye to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen. And it might not be the sort of discrimination that people think about. It's not so active, like, oh, I'm not doing this because I don't like her because she's a woman. It's more the act of omission, like I said.
Yeah, I think there's also something around what Nafeesa said about this idea of evidencing, and as Hayley said, you really are reliant on colleagues to a certain degree to not only to support you, but also to sort of back up what you're thinking. And I think potentially there's a challenge in an industry that is male dominated or less diverse, that comments that can be said in a meeting room, if another woman or another minority person was there, they might think, oh, geez, that was very dismissive, or that was very unfair. And they will feel that sort of viscerally within them because they've been the target of those comments themselves before, and they know what that feels. They know what that feels like. Whereas it may not even register on the radar of somebody else because they may just pass it off as, oh, that person's having a bad day, or that person's grumpy, or that's just that. And so there's that feeling then of feeling overly sensitive or doubting your own opinions. Things I've seen in my own experience are, women coming forward and saying that they're not being taken seriously in meetings, that everything they say, somebody turns to their manager to double check. And in the scheme of things, that doesn't sound like a big deal, like it's a 3-second detour in the scheme of a large meeting. But when that happens every time, that feeling in the pit of your stomach, if you're not used to that feeling, then maybe you just don't think anything of it. And so I think that's part of that disconnect, that when we're in an industry that isn't as diverse as we would like it to be, it can be hard to find, not just that people wouldn't support you, they would, but they just don't feel the need to, because they don't sense that same that same sense of distress that person is feeling in that moment.
I would add one other thing that I've just thought of is that it can be, and this just goes, I think, not just for our industry, but probably for a lot of others too, but especially where you have so few women, is that it can be really hard to report when you don't see impacts being had of other people reporting. And it makes you think, is it worth me doing this? Is it just going to cause me more stress and actually, damage my career? Even when really it's somebody else who's at fault, even if it's quite extreme and quite well evidenced, that it's going to cause problems for you regardless. So, and I think that goes for a lot of places. So unless you see actively that organizations hold people to account for, acts of discrimination, I don't think you'd be encouraged to report.
If I can just build on that, Hayley, as well, I think when people, from my experience, when somebody has reported or challenge what's happened, it's almost like the organisation can go into a panic, a free fall of, oh no, somebody has discriminated against someone. And actually it's a shame, because what I've seen is that we then, a situation that could be dealt with quite sensibly and probably quite quickly escalates very quickly, and the person that's at the centre of the complaint, who's made the complaint, is suddenly can be surrounded by external parties, external third parties that are brought in to almost adjudicate the situation, because the organisation has, they've run into a panic response, as opposed to let's deal with this, let's hold people to account. It's gone straight to an external resource because actually it's too difficult to deal with internally.
Yeah, there's also a power dynamic often at play. I mean, we know from the stats, right, that women tend to be in lower positions than men. So the chances are, if you're reporting something, you're going to be reporting somebody who's more senior than you, which creates an uncomfortable power dynamic anyway, but also means that this person probably has a different level of value to the organization, which, you know, can play out very differently. I've seen it happen in various different ways. You know, that also is going to discourage people from reporting. And if you don't have a woman higher up who may have experienced a similar thing, why would you feel comfortable reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that thing, isn't it, that if you felt like there was somebody you could go to quietly, confidentially mention it, and it would be handled quietly, you know, that it would be addressed, it would be taken seriously, but without sort of serious consequences, just sort of as a this cannot happen again, then you would feel like you could report those small things that happened before they built up into a bigger trend of problems, rather than having to record, you know, which is what we're all told, record any events so that then you can evidence that to HR. When you get to that point, it is a big deal. And then there's, you know, it has to be taken very seriously. Whereas actually, I think we'd all prefer if it could just be dealt with in the moment and with the best of intentions, and we didn't have to do that. But it's very hard to feel like you can do that.
And there's a huge amount of emotion as well that an individual's going through at that time, you know, that not only the self-doubt, but also just you kind of repeating the moment in your mind over and over again, and then you're asked to evidence it, and then you're asked to repeat what you've seen, who saw you, who was with you, and it becomes, yeah, absolutely, you know, you've got to be this, not only you're upset, but you're also being asked to be a superhuman individual and evidence what you've seen in a kind of almost as though you're having an out-of-body experience and reporting what the situation that's happened, despite you being stressed, upset, anxious. Perhaps you've had to go to HR. So yeah, it's a really challenging kind of situation.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, particularly the that power dynamic that you were talking about there, Hayley, can be a real challenge. I know that in the last couple of weeks, there has been sort of a Me Too moment within the space sector, with someone reporting some sexual harassment that happened, you know, quite a long time ago, but it relates to, you know, a senior person within the space sector, a junior woman reporting it, and I think that power dynamic has very much been at play, and also, as you've mentioned, Nafeesa, the organizations going into panic and putting out, you know, very bland statements saying, "Oh, you know, this seems like it might be a bit too complicated. Let's, you know, not get too into it." And you know, we see that all over the place, not just within the space sector. You know, it's definitely a symptom of a wider problem there. One of the things that was mentioned was, you know, colleagues in the room not supporting you, and I think that's really interesting when we look at the statistics on witnessing. We see that women report having witnessed discrimination much more than men, and in the case of sexual harassment, I think this is the one that really stood out for me, was that no one said that they've seen sexual harassment, but quite a lot of women reported having experienced it. And there's such a mismatch there. Does that mean it's all happening behind closed doors? You know, is it something where we need to sort of train up men to be a lot more aware of this sort of thing, so that they can provide that support?
I can start since no one else is unmuting. Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily about that, and I don't think it's just about men. I think particularly when you've mentioned there the sexual harassment, that's, you know, that it's there but nobody's seeing it, and I don't think it's because this is all happening behind closed doors. I think it's because as a culture we're trained to kind of, even as humans, we're trained to kind of ignore things that you know, or hide from things that scare us, things that make us uncomfortable. And in relation to, you know, the sort of Me Too moment that you've mentioned there, Joseph, that was part of the reason that I felt so strongly about that, because I know that I've been in those rooms, and again, there's still power dynamics at play that, you know, you can hear maybe more senior men in the industry talking about, oh yes, well that person always seems to conveniently hire young attractive women, or various conversations like that you just overhear, and you kind of, you note it away for a sort of, well, maybe I don't get too close to that person if after a few drinks or whatever it might be. But we shouldn't have to store that in the back of our mind, but that's what you do. And it's really easy to look at things that make you a little bit uncomfortable and think, well, they're adults, they probably can deal with it themselves, they know what they're doing, and sort of not want to get involved, not want to stick your oar in. I think it's not necessarily about feeling like we need to spot it and start waving red flags. I think actually maybe sometimes it's just about asking the question, are you okay? And seeing what's going on the inside, rather than thinking, oh, it's not my business, and turning away. And maybe it is fine. But I think it's not so much about not seeing it, it's about asking those questions to make sure that there is nothing going on that isn't right.
Just building on that, I think there's also sexual harassment, also sexual there's manipulation that I've seen. So the kind of the male figure that may be more senior in an organization using that as a way of manipulating the thoughts of a younger woman, you know, to help encourage them to develop their themselves and challenge what's going on around them, but in a very strange way that can be using the kind of the power of mind and belief to manipulate a young person's thinking to where they perhaps are not aware of what's going on around them as well. So using the power of kind of the seniority to say, well, if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll be able to make this leap, or you should be able to do this next, or, you know, just hang out with me and good things will happen. I also have witnessed that, and it feels very uncomfortable. And just as you've said, you know, I think asking that question, are you okay? Are you aware of what's going on? How do you feel about this? Are all good questions to ask, and anyone can ask those. It doesn't have to be another woman asking a woman. It can be anybody, just challenging the situation. And, you know, what's the worst that's going to happen out of that? You're going to get an answer that's probably, yes, I'm okay, and that's fine, you know, park that for a while. Or you'll get somebody reaching out and asking you why, or they may feel offended that you've asked, but at least kind of you've asked and you've challenged what's going on around you. So it's really important to ask those questions.
Hayley, did you want to come in on this one? I think you're muted.
Sorry, my spacebar doesn't always seem to work when I hit it to unmute. Yeah, it's a difficult one, this. I think there's a lot of people, and this is, you know, generic when it comes to sexual harassment, not just in our sector, but anywhere where there's a power dynamic that's unequal, that we sometimes won't even accept what's happening, because to accept it means that you have to really take to heart what is going on and how bad it is. And even just accepting that can be more difficult than, you know, if you look at the consequences, you might feel compelled to deal with the consequences. We were reading various testimonies that came out during the kind of main part of the Me Too movement, and lots of them saying that, you know, it wasn't until somebody else said to me, this isn't right, that I really, really appreciated just how wrong this was. And those were quite serious, you know, sexual harassment, like quite, you know, assault kind of levels of things. And even when it's that serious, sometimes people can't, or it's a self-protective thing, right? They try and sort of close down from really acknowledging what's going on in order to protect themselves. So the power of other people saying, no, look, I've seen this, are you all right? I don't think this is right, can be really, really liberating, and I think can actually help us make a lot of progress.
We've had a couple of comments in the chat. The one about pay I will come back to in just a moment, but there are two here to do with how we might handle reporting around discrimination. So Gemma Wilson has said that, you know, lots of organizations have got diversity and inclusion groups. is there a way we could use those to report acts of discrimination and deal with them in a sensible way? And I guess the counter to that is, or is it more of an HR issue? And then Sean has asked whether we think it might be something that could emulate safeguarding. So having a designated person and building up a picture of what's going on without necessarily providing detailed evidence. Anyone like to?
Okay. I think those are both quite good ideas, really, having intermediaries that sort of accumulate some anonymous information about behavior. I mean, you can see it in the report, the stats here, that the number of people who say they've experienced harassment, the number who say they haven't seen it. I mean, it's clearly there are things going on around that everyone's not aware of. So having an organisation that can somewhat independently collect this information together is really, really valuable. And as you say, can also offer a way for people to start approaching the topic without having to go, to HR directly. It's certainly useful to have somebody back. I know a lot of unions offer this support. I've seen.
You muted halfway through that, Hayley.
I'm sorry, what was the last thing I said that you heard?
You mentioned unions. You said that a lot of unions.
Yes, a lot of unions offer this facility to act as kind of an independent sort of person. So you can go to the union, your union rep, talk to them about what's happened, and they can say, yeah, I think you've got a good case for this, or this would be the likely outcome, or actually a lot of other people have said the same thing about this person, or we had another example where this happened and we were able to get, some sort of justice. They'll usually reaffirm that you're not alone, that you're not crazy for thinking what you think, but also will offer you very practical ways of going through the process that you might need to go through to bring this to these.
You've muted again there, but I think we got most of that. Nafeesa or Ciara, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, it brings into question the role of HR, right, in the organisations, and is the role of HR not powerful enough, not doing the job that it's there to do, or HR protecting the business and protecting the individual? So, I guess the thought of having somebody independent, like a safeguarding officer or the equivalent, it is a great idea, or using an independent group who are probably volunteers looking after gender inequality issues is a good idea. I'd like to, there's a lot of thinking to be done around that interplay with HR still, and the role, and when do you hit the limit if you've got a few reports about a particular individual? When's the right time then to take that forward? And is it too late if you're kind of saving up all of these stories? That's not dealing with something in the moment, it's dealing with something after you've got, because suddenly 5 cases make it good enough to take forward. So there's a bit of a balancing act to do there as well.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it depends on the organization as well, because certainly, within a university, for example, it's a very big organization. So HR seems like something kind of over there and ethereal. It's a nameless email address. Whereas obviously having someone maybe within your team or within your department, for example, could be more helpful. But then you've got this balance between somebody who's, if they're part of the department, will know everybody, and then that puts its own barriers towards reporting, because obviously friendships and alliances form within any sort of organization. So there's a question there about that. You want someone that's close enough to be approachable, but far enough away that they're independent. And I've yet to see something that strikes a balance there. But I think the point Hayley made about unions is excellent. I didn't know that was something that existed. So I will definitely be taking that on board for future.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance to get right. And I think also, one of the things that we saw within the stats about the kinds of roles women work in, administrative roles like HR tend to be dominated by women. So and we know that those are more junior women. So you're almost in a situation where you, as a junior woman, you're reporting to another junior woman in HR about this, and the seniority issue is still in play there, even when HR is involved. I'm going to move us on a little bit to talk about the pay and seniority gap. So one of the things that we've seen in this data is that there is a pay gap across all levels. Now, to some extent, this is because women in the space sector tend to be younger and therefore more junior, quite apart from sort of promotion issues, but just because they're earlier in their careers. But one of the things that we found was whatever you control for, whether that's role or subject studied or years of experience or anything like that, women are always paid less. And for women at particular age levels, if you compare that to the similar age group of men, the men will be further along in terms of seniority and so on. What do you think the main drivers for this are?
I can think of two things really on this. The first one being this quite well acknowledged thing that women don't tend to ask for more pay. So if you have pay, like when you get a job, if you have a pay structure that is negotiable, that isn't very well, sort of leveled and based upon clear criteria, then women are less likely to negotiate as high as men. This seems to be quite a well acknowledged thing across the board. But the second thing is about like promotion and actually how people get promoted. The people who get promoted are always the high performers, right? You have to show that you're performing at a very high level. And especially at a certain age and depending on a certain career path as well, there are some people who are probably more likely to have more time than others. Women who've gone through a PhD are likely to be starting their career in an organization around about the same time they have children. Unless they have a very equal partnership, they're not going to have the extra time that would help them get the extra stuff done that might help them get promotion. Whereas I think, just the way our society still works, unfortunately, this also discriminates against men who choose to take a more active role in the family life as well, right? So there's that part as well. But I think statistically, we still see that tends to fall to where society still.
Yeah, just to hop on the maternity one, I thought one of the things that really coming through my PhD and my younger career years, I actually thought I didn't see a lot of discrimination. I didn't see a lot of unfairness. Where I started to notice it was as I got older and more senior members of staff started advising me on how I should plan ahead, that if I ever wanted to take maternity, I needed to be strategic starting now. And I'm pretty sure men were not getting the same advice from people in senior positions. And while I appreciated it, it really pointed out a stark difference in how, that this, again, is probably going on behind closed doors. Probably other men in the same role are not aware of these conversations that are being passed down through the organization on how you manage your maternity leave so you don't cripple your career. But it's terrible to think that those are the conversations that we have to have. And I think on the point that you made, Hayley, about this, promotion criteria, I think there's also looking at this, what I said earlier about this senior management having a certain demographic. I think there's also an argument that some of the things that are considered for promotion criteria are not necessarily a fair set of criteria to be looking at, and that certain contributions can be overlooked. So particularly in my role in academia, there's a tendency that women get, can be at risk of getting more teaching or more sort of, these kind of roles. We're also obviously across all organizations asked to do a lot more outreach and a lot more public engagement because companies want to front run their women, ensure that they have them. So, and I mean, it's a great thing to do to encourage women into the industry, but it does mean that it's an extra aspect of work that not everyone else in the organization shares evenly. And if those particular criteria aren't taken into account for promotion, as they often maybe aren't, they might be taken into account, but not necessarily weighted as heavily as other things, then that also disadvantages people. So I think there's there's sort of two problems there where you're being squished in the middle, that you're not only just trying to strategize to have that extra time, but the time that you have is stretched further and across roles that maybe aren't appreciated as much as other aspects.
I think there's another factor. factor there. Sorry, Hayley. There's also the attributes that people look for senior leaders, and those attributes tend to be male attributes. So being assertive, acting like a boss, being micromanaging people, driving your employees. Really, a lot of the kind of the male attributes of things. If a group of men are looking at who to promote next, and they're looking at a woman, that sometimes that assertiveness that they're looking for, and the attributions and characteristics that they're looking for in their next leader, don't make you always think about a woman doing that role. And just to build on one of your points from earlier as well, when I was chatting to colleagues about some of these stats, one of the stories that was shared with us was around somebody going for an interview for a role and being asked what their life plan was in that interview. So when were they going to have children? When was that going to happen in their career path? Because actually that was, and funnily enough, I think it was her boyfriend or husband at the time was going for the same job and was not asked any of those questions, right? So she was asked about her life plan and her plans to have children. So that's actively happening right now.
I mean, I suppose that the other thing was, just on that note, was I've recently gotten my job. I've just started at the University of Manchester, and I was having dinner with my parents a while ago and talking about it, and they were making the point that a certain number of years ago, maybe not that long ago, when my mum was looking for work, that I wouldn't have been hired at my age into this role. There's no way, because precisely those things. So things have improved. But yeah, it's quite scary to see that these things are still going on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, these are the kinds of things that, as a man, I'm not aware. I think as you mentioned about someone's partner, that these things are happening in those interviews. Because they're not questions that I ever hear, and you don't really, unless you're also on the interviewing panel. Interviews are very much closed door, and servicing that kind of stuff, I think, is really important and useful. Particularly, one of the things that the Space Skills Alliance does is provide some guidance about how to approach things like interviews and hiring. One of those is around the language. I think you're absolutely right that we can tend to associate particular attributes with being promotable, which it's all kind of arbitrary and very cultural. And what it actually does is skew the playing field. And the contributions of women don't get recognized in the same way. We've had a question here from Alex asking whether women are more likely to be promoted in companies which already have more senior women. Is there a case of sort of mentoring and women helping more junior women out? Is that something that you've seen or experienced yourselves?
I'm sort of trying to think. The last organization I was in, I'm trying to think how many senior women there were who could have helped me out. You know what I mean? I suspect I was going to say, is that in the data? Do you have that data? But I suspect it's probably a very challenging thing to pick apart. And potentially a reasonably small data set. I certainly think it couldn't hurt. And I think also, based on what you said, Joe, I mean, it's not just women, it's all minority groups who are affected by that, right? The stereotype of what a leader should be. And I think having more diverse people at the table will improve all of that. I don't think it can hurt, if only because they may stop and ask the question, are we being fair? Because if you've experienced unfair treatment, you're more likely to question it.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, that it's probably a pretty small number of companies that you could actually look at to see if this has had an effect, because I've never really worked or seen a company in the space sector that's had more than a handful of very senior women. So few women in general, and then very, very few in senior roles. However, I do think that just having somebody who will view the life experience in a similar way, I would feel that, like, as a woman who's gone through maternity, for example, that having a woman on the panel for an interview who's also gone through maternity, she might look at what I achieved in that time in a different way to what a man would. You know, she would go, wow, you actually achieved that, that's a lot. You know, you're clearly very dedicated, as opposed to, you know, somebody who might go, oh yeah, they took maternity for this long, or not even think about it, you know, because you wouldn't think about it unless you had the experience necessarily.
Nafeesa, did you want to come in on this one?
So, as other colleagues have said, it's really difficult to judge. We certainly have a lack of senior leaders in amongst the organisations that we work with that are women, that are diverse, actually. And I'm always hesitant to comment on this because I just wonder, sometimes I do feel, you know, relatively senior, I guess, in our organisation. And in the back of my mind, I wonder whether I sometimes wonder whether I'm selecting things based on tokenism to make up numbers, as opposed to, and it's a question I shouldn't question myself, I'm sure, but you do sometimes wonder how many times women are used to kind of are promoted or put into certain situations to make up that percentage, to make it look less bad, whether that's in a meeting, whether it's on a panel, whether it's, you know, something else. I'd love to not have to worry about that. I don't know how we fix it, but I would love not to worry about that.
Yeah, I agree, but I think these things can be done right. So to give an example from my own personal experience, I was called in to help with an interview at one point. And when I asked the people involved, you know, how will we hold this interview? They said, oh, we'll just go in and talk to them and we'll see what happens. And being aware of, you know, how these things can be so biased, I went away and put together a set of skills that I felt were required for the role, and then handed them all out to everyone with a table that they could score against, and basically said, well, why don't we use this to frame the discussion, and then we have something that we know will be comparable between everyone. And oh, that's a great idea. And it didn't take an awful lot of work, but I think it was that stopping and questioning it. And I think that's something that we could all do more of. And it you know, it only affected maybe one interview, but maybe it'll be taken forward by the people who experience that. And I think it's just that stopping and questioning that we need to all do a little bit more of where we can.
I did, just on the interview thing, I did have a very fun example recently where we were told we had too many women on the panel and we're asked to bring in a man. So it does work both ways sometimes.
I think for certain roles that's certainly the case, right? I mean, I always think, you know, there's always a flip side to all of this. I mean, if you're a man who is an HR professional, you must feel this exact situation in reverse. So, you know, being aware that this affects women in technical disciplines probably means it also affects men just as badly in, you know, disciplines that are considered much more the communion of women. And that can only definitely benefit us all if we address it one way as well.
I'm going to have to call our discussion to an end there, but some really interesting points. I know I'm going to be continuing thinking about them over the next few days, and hopefully for those of you watching, that you've also, you know, sparked some thoughts about, you know, maybe some things that you can do within your organization, or you know, roles that you can play, whether that is just you know, asking people how they are, as Ciara suggested, or you know, asking those questions about how you can be more objective in hiring and promotion processes, or pushing for you know, unions and other independent organizations to be involved in these sorts of things, so that people feel that they've got a way to report this and see action taken. I'm going to pass over to Hayley to wrap us up. But thank you very much to our panel for all your wonderful contributions.
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, because I think that was really fascinating listening to all your thoughts, stats and experiences. So a huge thanks for the really fascinating discussion. We have our report on women in the space sector and many other reports that we've written on our website, which is spaceskills.org. You can also find a space recruitment toolkit there if you do want to know a bit more about how to make your hiring a bit more fair. So a huge thank you to Nafeesa, Hayley, Ciara and Joseph for chairing. And if you do want any more stats and chats, then stay tuned. We will be doing future events like this for other reports that will come out in the future. For now, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a really lovely rest of your day.